Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
It's all Greek to me and my guests here today, pursued by the fates, guided by Zeus, frequently cursed but with a smidgen of mortal free will. They have, in their various ways, been in search of the traces of ancient Greeks in our lives and our beliefs today. Simon Armitage is a poet and translator who's spun a new tale of the last days of Troy from various classical sources. The playwright Frank McGuinness has reimagined the Thebans in a libretto for English National Opera. Natalie Haynes combines teenagers and a tale of bloody Greek-inspired revenge. What could possibly go wrong? And the writer Kenan Malik has been delving into the roots of modern morality in his latest book on the history of global ethics. Simon, the last days of Troy, you start the play in modern-day Turkey, in Herzliya, with Zeus now reduced to playing himself as a statue for today's legions of tourists. Why this particular reincarnation?
Well, I'd been to the archaeological site, and it was a place that always haunted me anyway. You know, it's somewhere that stands between mythology and rumour and history. And originally when I started writing the play, there's so much information and backstory that I wanted to get into it. I'd actually created a latter-day reporter, a war correspondent in the region. But the more I played with the play, I suddenly started becoming very interested in the idea of Zeus as an immortal, as somebody who could not die, and started to wonder what the gods were doing if they could not die, but nobody believed in them anymore. And
that's a challenge to immortality, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I suppose, as Hera says to him at one point, you're going to have to get used to it. And I kept thinking about all those people that you see on the Royal Mile during the Edinburgh Festival, standing there on boxes, spray painted, quite often as classical characters with their hand out, begging for money, and that contradiction really between being a god or a royal of some kind, and yet actually being a street person.
I'm interested that you stitched together various accounts, various authors from the classical world to give yourself this narrative.
I think the job of the playwright, even when you're dealing with ancient texts and ancient subjects, is to create a plausible universe, a world that people can believe in. And you can stretch the fabric of that universe with the language without actually breaking it. Something that, completely anachronistic, mention of a modern noun object like a mobile phone will break the spell. But in terms of what people say to each other and how they say it, I think you can take risks, because if you stick to a language that we might be able to call original and authentic, you'll be back to the original poem. In terms of the story, the two stories really that I've stitched together are the story of the Iliad and Virgil's later telling of what happened at the end of Troy. And I simply thought that modern theatre goers deserve and require an ending. They want to know who wins the war. They want to know who happens to Achilles. These things are implied. But we want to see them, and I wanted a big horse in this play anyway.
Well, I think if you could have the Trojan War without the horse, it would really not be worth the cover price, would it? True enough. But the story of the Trojan War specifically, we're talking today about resonances. You have some that have stitched in, which seem to point forward to World War I. Do you think that's a bit of a stretch?
No, actually, I think it's more difficult to keep these things out. World War I is in people's minds, the idea of commemoration and elegy, and also the horror, because you talk about World War I and it always brings up those terrible images of the battlefield, and those images were in Homer's mind as well. Equally, I think within the piece as I've written it, there is a parallel to not just what's going on now, but what seems to me to have been going on since Homer's day, and that is some kind of conflict between East and West. The Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, that cultural, political, economic, religious fault line across which people have been in conflict almost continually. And again, you hardly have to do anything when you're talking about the Iliad to make those parallels and those comparisons. It's almost written in.
But there are the grand themes of history. Obviously, the geopolitics shift a bit, though, as you point out, some of it stays roughly in the same region. But then you also have a focus on the individuals at the heart of the story and the bickering and the petulance. And we switch sometimes quite quickly from that to these grand and terrible scenes of the battlefield. How much do you think the Greeks are aware of ego and of what we now call sort of psychological flaws driving these characters?
Well, I think Homer was, very aware of that. I mean, that is the brilliance of the Iliad. How do you tell the story of a 10-year war without it becoming, either very long or very boring? And I think, Homer, whether he existed or not, and whether he wrote these things down or not, found the tipping point in that story. And actually what it boils down to is internal squabblings within each camp, between Trojans, between Greeks, between the gods. And in lots of ways...
But the Greek reader, let me just challenge you a bit on what would have you thought if you'd come to it as a Greek reader? You'd probably thought that, listening to the plays, you would have thought that something grander was at stake.
I think there is grandeur written into the characters, but I think it's your duty as a playwright to start stripping some of the shining armour away and to let these people bang heads together. I mean, in terms of the conflicts and the bloody battles and the grisly goings on, it's that tradition in Greek drama of allowing a lot of these things to take place off stage anyway. Although in the actual production, we will have big battles and rather surprising ones as well.
We're not going to be shortchanged on
Absolutely.
clashes of swords.
Absolutely.
Quite a lot of gorging goes on.
There'll be plenty of people there with spears.
Natalie, we're going to come to your novel a little while later, but you have that same fruitful tension between the grand remembered tales and using them in the present.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to step into it, because ultimately the reason why we're still listening to these stories or watching these stories after 2.5 millennia, or in Homer's case a bit longer, is because they are, I guess, archetypal, but also there is a certain level of purity to them which can stand up to virtually any rewriting. There's a reason why people keep reperforming the Trojan women, for example, at the moment, is about the consequences of war. It's about how the victors in a war are utterly brutalised by their victory. It's about how the victims in a war can't ever stop being victimised. Every time they think they've lost everything, it turns out there's just one more thing and just one more thing that they can lose. And it is horrifying. And while war keeps happening, it will always be contemporary. You can strip everything away from it except the story, and it will be complete. And the thing is that even the Greeks, even Aristophanes, used to mock Euripides for bringing his kings down from, the fine level of Sophocles or Aeschylus down to, they're wearing rags and wandering about on a beach. So people have been saying, oh, well, these kings should be a bit grander than that for at least 2,500 years, for what it's worth.
Natalie mentioned the female role there at the beginning, Simon, and it's good to see Helen get a bit more of an outing. She doesn't just launch 1,000 ships and then sit back quietly here.
No, she's a bit of a walk-on part, really, in the Iliad. But I was thinking of her in some ways as the Iraqi supergun in this piece. She's the reason why two civilizations clash in an all-out war. And I was interested in her response to that. I was interested in her position in all that and her reaction at the end. So she became, in my mind, a much larger character, at least in person, as she is in some of those original texts. So yeah, she's centre stage in this production.
Kenan.
What's striking though is how alien is the moral world of Homer and of the ancient Greeks, even though we continually plunder it for understanding our world and our moral lives. I mean, Homer doesn't really... It's interesting, you were talking about concepts of the ego and flaws and so on. But Homer doesn't really have a concept of the mind and of the interior in the way we do, which is why he transposes that. When we think about the mind and of internal flaws and of our internal life, he doesn't think of it that way. He transposes it into the life of the gods, which is why the life of the gods, the gods are there They're not kind of wise and judicious as later the gods of Christianity or Judaism.
They're downright capricious.
They are. They're capricious and vain and deceitful and immoral, and they're very human. And it's because he can't look inside our minds in the way we can. So he looks outside, and it's interesting that over the centuries, that our internal life has become a lot more transparent. But the life of the gods has become a lot more opaque, but we use the one to understand the other these days.
Let me bring Frank McGuinness in on this, because this obviously plays a role if you're doing a modern libretto of Thebans. Did you think about that change?
Not in the slightest, actually, no. I just went with it. I just thought, right, this has to work for a modern audience. Let's go.
Not full-on Greeks for now.
Let's go. I am not a teacher of Greek. I'm not a Greek philosopher. I write plays, and I want audiences to be shattered, to be moved, to be involved with what's happening. And that's what happens to me when I let a Greek play work. The first one I ever saw was Electra when I was about 15 on television. The great Eileen Atkins did it in a black and white BBC One production. And it made complete sense to me. I knew what it was talking about. It made utter sense why this woman would do what she did, why she would weep the way that she did. There was no need for any kind of learning to know about that. I responded to it as a piece of literature, as a piece of theatre.
Well, the Thebans loosely follows the fortunes of Oedipus and his daughter. You've written the libretto, the music's composed by Julian Anderson. In a play, the words and the action are pretty much everything. In an opera, how much are your words serving the music? Actually,
I hope that what Julian needed, I gave him. We talked long and hard about what had to be cut, long and hard about what had to be condensed. We came to an agreement about what you could get away with, in effect. And but I left it entirely in his capable hands, because I think, you go to an opera for the music. And the musician, the composer, has to be the decisive force. I had worked a fair bit with singers, a couple of singers before, written songs for them, and I knew that Marianne Faithfull in particular, who's got a great musical brain, I mean, she really knows what'll work as a piece of text for a song. And I had learnt an immense amount from her on how to say what you mean in a song, and say no more, and indeed say less even, and leave the power of the voice and the power of the melody or whatever, or as she calls it, the refrain, to do the work of it. So I was all right with that, actually. I wasn't hung up about it.
You've said you just grabbed this and went for it with instinct, I suppose, rather than intellect at the front of your considerations. But why Greek myth at all? I mean, why not?
Well, for me, I mean, the play that helped me to understand my father best was Oedipus. It took me about 10 years after his death to finally admit that he was dead. And I couldn't, I don't think I could have done it when my father was alive. And in many ways, I denied myself the mourning for him. But in that story, in the way Sophocles told it, I had a framework and a narrative to do it. And it ripped me to pieces, writing that, because I had never wept for him. I did at the last speech of the play. I really felt that he was with me very closely, and I thought that that was why I'd been given the gift to do it. At the end, it took me a long time, as I say, to even try it. I had commissioned a literal maybe 10 years before he died, so it was about 20 years in the brooding, the play. And until I was at a certain stage in my own life, I couldn't deal with this terrible confrontation with my own sense of guilt and my own sense of loss and grief for a man I didn't really know.
Tell us a bit about how you crafted the end of the story.
This is for the opera.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we're taking a liberty in that the trilogy, the progress of the trilogy is Oedipus, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone. And I think that what we've done is we've done Oedipus, then Antigone, and then Oedipus at Colonus. I had seen the trilogy twice on stage, and on each occasion I felt Antigone seriously shortchanged me as the end to the story, in the way that it never has done when I've seen it as a single play. I think it's a fabulous play, but I don't think it's, the right end to this. So what I wanted to try and do, being a believer in what Yeats calls, the fascination of what's difficult, I wanted to try to get across and to recapture maybe the strangeness of these plays and the shock of these plays. And Colonus itself, the place, is a holy place, a sacred place. I think it's where Sophocles was born, and it seems to have been an extraordinary, dark, and simultaneously clear place where the dead and the living confront each other. I had to go back to my childhood to a sense of a holy place, a sacred place. And I remember when I was a kid, around our local Catholic church, there was a beautiful lawn which we were terrified of stepping on because you committed a mortal sin if you trod on the holy grass. And I wanted to get back to that idea of belief in the holy grass and to make Colonus, as I say, an ordinary place, an extraordinary place. And by putting it at the end, then I'm deliberately jarring and deliberately disturbing the perception of myself and of the audience.
You might just summarise for us the story of Antigone and just how you've approached it.
Well, Antigone herself is an avenger. She is a woman who has been told she cannot bury her brother by Creon, the tyrant who's in charge of Thebes. She defies him. He is an extremely complex character, Creon. I've never really seen the play develop what I think is there, which is a profound sexual jealousy of Antigone in it. Creon is in love with his son, and in this world of jealousies and incests, I think that fits in extraordinarily well with the other plays in the trilogy. He has her killed, he has her destroyed, and Haman the son commits suicide as well. But I do feel that that's a much more disturbed sexually play than it's usually presented. And I feel that what Antigone does in confronting Creon, she's paying him back for the terrible thing that he does to her father. At the very end of Oedipus, one of the last things he does, Creon, is to take Oedipus's daughter away from him. And that, I think, is an act that reverberates through the other two plays.
But you've said that Antigone is the hero of the piece, and I thought that was very interesting, because having seen the last production at the National and other versions, there's often a sense of Antigone as a victim, or as a slightly kind of representative of a peace,
oh God, no, I don't think
peace-loving order.
Remotely a victim. I think she's an extraordinary, brilliant warrior. She's out there and she avenges her family.
She makes a choice, right? I mean,
Completely.
She's completely certain that the right thing to do is to be loyal to your family and to the rule of the gods, which is why she's so often, when it's staged now, she is so often presented to us as somewhere between a freedom fighter and a terrorist. She genuinely thinks that God's law is more important than state law, and Creon thinks that the state's law is more important than God's law.
And she has one of the most terrifying lines in Western literature, which is, "I love those I love, and I will not hate them." And that, I mean, in Irish politics, there's the core of an awful lot of glory and of gore and of guts. But it's a tremendous line.
Kenan,
The way we look upon Antigone and Creon is very different from the way that Sophocles would have looked upon Antigone and Creon, because we can't but see Antigone as somebody who's a heroine, somebody who's fighting for her family, her honour and so on, and Creon as some kind of brutal tyrant. There was a very famous Bertolt Brecht production where Creon comes over as a manic, strutting Hitler. And Antigone is a kind of the spirit of popular resistance.
And at the National, they made him sort of Stasi.
Yeah,
that's right.
Whereas for Sophocles, Creon's not a tyrant at all in that sense, because he's defending the city, the community, and that whole relation. And Antigone's challenging the sanctity of the community, and therefore the way we understand the relationship between the two is very different from the way that Sophocles would have.
I've heard that before, and I've seen a lot of productions that try to argue that line. And I go back to the play, and I look at the actual text of Antigone. And if that is the case, I don't understand why Sophocles makes Creon such an idiot. Why is he such a bad king?
Let's hear from Simon.
Slight sidebar here, but I just wanted to belatedly side with Frank that, about not presenting a sort of textbook of Greek morals, but actually trying to, produce a performance for a contemporary audience. But it's a question really, Frank. Will we be able to hear the words? Because I've seen what you've written, and it's presented beautifully. It reads to me as a verse drama, but my experience of opera is that we will not hear a word of it, and I wonder how frustrating that's going to be for something which you're clearly very emotionally involved in. I think it was
You're not giving English National Opera much credit in advance.
It was Craig
there,
Wren, I think, who once said that librettists are to opera what toilets are to theatres, and I've had some of that experience myself, and I'm just wondering if you're braced for this thing which is so meaningful to you that we might not be able to experience the full power of your language.
Well, I've cleaned many a theatre toilet in my time. and I do not speak figuratively, but also metaphorically. But I am pleasantly happy with the amount that is audible in what I'm hearing there now, actually. The singer playing Crayon is remarkably accurate. And getting all the shades of opinion and shades of argument that he can have. But it is a sacrifice that I think you have to be willing to make if you're going to go into that business of writing for music. The music is the priority.
Well, dysfunctional families, fratricide, incest, murder, the Greek tragedies have it all alongside an elevated view of what's fair, seething anger, desire for revenge, makes it perfect fodder, perhaps, for teenagers. And that's at the heart of your novel, Natalie, The Amber Fury. Why do you think teenagers and Greek tragedy is such a good mix?
Well, I suppose part of it's just personal. I started reading Greek tragedies when I was at school because I did Greek GCSE and then Greek A-level. And I didn't then know about Bernard Knox, the great classical scholar who wrote so brilliantly on the Greek hero in tragedy. But I completely understood, nonetheless, without any of the formal description, that heroes in Greek tragedies are almost always somebody who feels a utterly reasonable emotion taken to an unreasonable degree. And so Medea is the most obvious one. That's the first one I remember really changing my way of looking at the world. But it's a pretty legitimate position. Her husband has betrayed her. He's left her for a younger woman. She feels sexual jealousy. Of course she does. That's not a bad side to her character. Taking it that little step further, poisoning his new wife, poisoning his new father-in-law, killing their children, an act of... Now maybe we've gone a little bit too far. But I have to be honest with you, when I was 16, that seemed utterly proportionate to the crime to me. I should emphasise now that I don't have children, don't write in, it's all fine. But it seemed kind of fair enough when Hecate, or Hecuba, depending on whether you prefer your names Greek or Roman, when she discovers what's happened to her, the very last son that she has left at the end of the Trojan War, the one that she thinks hasn't been killed, turns out to have been killed in the most venal way. Her revenge is astonishing. She is, of course, a reasonable mother. She's a mother who's lost her son. Of course she's angry. The act of revenge that she takes is to kill the children of the man who has killed her son and then blind him. So the last thing he will ever see is his children being killed in revenge for having killed her son. How could you not, at 17, think this was the most extraordinary thing in the world? And
the absorbing thing, of course, is that with Antigone and Medea, they look at other different outcomes, more moderate outcomes, yes, and they still choose the most extreme and destructive.
Yes, I mean, Medea's great monologue where she says, "Shall I, shan't I, kill my children," is one of the genuinely great monologues in all of theatre. And she properly considers it. She considers it from every angle. If she does this, it will be much more painful to her than it will be to Jason. She loves their children far more than Jason does. He's quite happy to see them banished. And banished isn't like, being sent to a nice island somewhere and having a lovely time. They could easily die in banishment. But that's still... she will injure herself to the millionth degree in order to cause him a tiny sliver of pain, if that's all she can cause him. And that is a choice that she makes. It's an extraordinary speech.
But of course you do have your modern sort of crime thrillerish narrative threaded through this. Your central character tries to engage her unruly group of rather troubled teenagers with these plays. You start with Oedipus, you move on to Alcestis. Why choose these plays around which you can then weave a plot, which we're not going to give away?
Of course they start with Oedipus, because Oedipus is all about free will and destiny. It's about whether you have any choice or whether you are basically an organic robot. Has everything been predetermined? Has it been predetermined by the stars, by the fates, by your atoms? There are all kinds of versions of predeterminism, and that's the debate that's right at the centre of Oedipus. And the 5 teenagers in my book have been dealt an extremely rough hand by the fates. They have been not born into lovely, happy, joyous, embracing families. They've been brought up in a very difficult world. And so they're pretty entitled to discuss whether your destiny has something to say about how you turn out. The Alcestis is all about sacrifice. It's all about whether you would give yourself up for somebody you love.
The teacher, who's an eminently reasonable middle-class woman, and you have a point where you just say, basically, something terrible happens in her life and she wakes up one morning and she is the Furies.
Yes.
And she feels like the Furies. And that sense that within us there's almost this invisible cord that pulls us back to this world. I mean, Kenan saying, yes, morality changes and we look at things differently. We look at cause and effect and the mind differently. And yet
We're
You're
very
saying
elemental
she
folk.
can
Yeah.
wake up one morning with this terrible appetite for revenge.
Yes, I think I'm transfixed by the idea of people who can forgive, because it's not particularly in my nature. Forgetting, yes. Forgiving, not so much. And so it seemed to me much more likely that we spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about how people tend to respond when we can when it fits into a sort of nice, huggy New Testament narrative where we go, oh, OK, that's marvellous, well done for being so forgiving and how delightful. But I know I'm not that person, and I think terrible things happen to people who aren't nice too. And so I think she is a decent person, but
I'm beginning to wonder if you're safe to be let loose on the Greeks.
I don't know what you mean.
Simon.
I mean, forgiveness is one of the great moments in the Iliad as well,
Yes, it is.
between Priam and Achilles. But what I wanted to say was that the parts of your book that I found really, really fascinating were, I suppose, to do with those elements of Greek tragedy and Greek writing, which Kenan talks about in his book, about how they fed through into modern psychoanalysis, and the way that the kids are quite resistant to those plays in the classroom, but then start psychoanalysing each other and eventually themselves. And I found that really moving.
Thank you. Oh,
It was just a compliment.
I'm going to well up now.
Steady on.
I'm blushing on the radio, easily the stupidest response.
Yeah, she is actually. Very, very nice.
Sorry, everyone.
Pink face looking at me. Morality and revenge. I was struck by Frank saying earlier that sometimes that's the right thing to do. It is right to avenge yourself and your family. And yet so much of our modern understanding about moral behaviour or ethical lines are about don't do that, turn the other cheek, find a way around it, go to behavioural therapy, but don't take revenge.
Sure, the whole way we look at vengeance is very different from the way that, especially a Homeric society or heroic society would have looked at revenge. We're not just talking about Greek society, but we're talking about all heroic societies. Those are the kind of edge of written history. Whether in the Western tradition or the non-Western tradition, where honour is central to the way that society becomes organised, and where morality is organised. You understand it through honour. And one of the shifts, I think, that happens in Greece, but also elsewhere, globally, it happens in China and India, it's a shift from an honour-based morality to a morality where one thinks about it in terms of reason. And so one reasons about what is right and wrong rather than it given in terms of honour. I think that's an important shift that takes place.
And the final play your characters study is the Oresteia, where the cycle of violence is broken and reason and judgment begin to play a role. Some people think this is the foundation of a kind of modern idea or modern systems of justice. And yet your characters as a group never get there.
I think I would agree with that. I would say that the Eumenides is the moment where Western civilization changes. Until that point, essentially, the whole plot of the Oresteia is somebody killed somebody, we should kill somebody in revenge. So before the Trojan War starts, Agamemnon kills his daughter Iphigenia as a sacrifice to get the wind to sail to Troy. And he comes back 10 years later while his wife has been sitting there drumming her fingers, and she, Clytemnestra, kills him in revenge. And then their children, Electra, Orestes, grow up, and they know they need to avenge their father, who has been killed. But of course, the person that they need to take vengeance upon is their mother. They are they're doing the wrong thing if they don't avenge their father. Blood guilt if they avenge him because it's against their mother. There is no right answer. And so Aeschylus this is a proper moment in drama, I would say, where, things properly change forever. Somebody says, oh, hold on a minute, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is the wrong way to go. A court of law is the solution to this problem. It's the moment where we stop living in a Bronze Age world and start living in classical Athens, at least theatrically.
Is that moment as well, if that's the beginning of sort of Western justice as we think of it, is that moment also the tipping point between a belief in fate and a belief in free will?
I hope so. I have no problem sustaining a sort of partial belief in both, but I guess when Democritus turns up with his Democritean swerve is the true moment where free will gets a bit of a go. But that's more Kenan's territory than mine.
Well, let's turn to you, Kenan Malik, and your book, The Quest for a Moral Compass, A Global History of Ethics. Despite what we've heard about the relevance of Greek myths and tragedies so far, do you think our moral sense has moved so far away from that time that it ceases to be a meaningful comparison? I
don't think so. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about Greek tragedies is both the they inhabit a very different moral universe to ours, and yet they explore the same kinds of issues and questions and try and apply reason to them in a way that allows us to draw and plunder them for understanding the very moral universe that we inhabit
Give me a good
today.
example of that.
Well, this question about what we were just talking about the shift from vengeance to justice, and the RSD as a three plays across which you can see the shift from gods who are the Furies, who are defined by vengeance, to Athena, who becomes the defining feature of the final play, who's defined by justice. And so you can see in that shift a shift that's become very important for us, for our moral universe too.
But some people looking at theories of justice now might say what's missing is something the other way round that allows people to feel that kind of catharsis, that something has been avenged, that a terrible crime has been avenged, as it is in Natalie's book, as it is all too frequently and bloodily with the Greeks, so that a over-emphasis on reason gets you to an interesting and complex legal system, but it doesn't satisfy what we might call bloodlust, or some people might just call justice.
Well, I'm not sure I'd describe our world as having an over-emphasis on reason. I mean, if you look at the questions of justice and right,
a highly codified approach to justice.
Well, that's a different matter. There is a distinction between a codified notion of morality and, say, a notion of morality that arises out of ideas of wisdom or flourishing, and I think there is a big distinction there. But you've got to remember that in the Greece of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, at the heart of it was not a set of rules, but the idea of morality as human flourishing.
Morality changes and evolves, of course. It isn't fixed. But do you find that there are certain points between which you can draw lines across? I know you've dealt with 3 millennia here. It's not purely relativist, is it?
No. There's a tendency to look at morality as something occupying its own sphere, as distinct from everything else, that we can understand moral issues distinct from the way we understand any other intellectual or social questions. And what I've tried to do is try and historicise morality in that sense, to say we can understand the story in the same way we can understand the stories of politics or social development or economics. It's striking that there are hundreds of books about the histories of ideas. There are dozens about histories of philosophy. There's almost no book. There's a handful of books about histories of morality, because the idea that you can understand it in historical terms seems so alien to the way we think about it. But I think it is really important. And it's important, I think, we can understand the relationship of morality to history in 2 ways. One is in relation to the structures of society and to social needs, and a morality growing out of particular social needs in particular kinds of societies. And secondly, in relation to the way we think of ourselves as human, because how we understand good and bad is very closely related to the way we think about what it is to be human. There's a point that Alistair MacIntyre, the Marxist turned Catholic philosopher, makes, and he says that where morality comes out of is the relationship between what he calls man as he happens to be and man as he wants to be. In other words, the way we are and the way we'd like to be, and it's out of the relationship between the two that we think about what morality is.
That bigs up the role of humans in morality and also social constructs but created by humans. But what about God? What about the divine and the idea of a God-given morality?
Well, there's a historical shift that takes place, because in the Greek world was defined by gods in many ways. I mean, theirs was a very religious world where fate was very, very important. But it's actually a very different notion of gods to that of Christianity, Judaism or Islam. Because, as we were saying before, Greek gods are very human. They are capricious and vain and deceitful and immoral, whereas the monotheistic gods are entirely all good, all powerful.
Well, they're pretty vain and violent and rather wicked in their way as well, if you look at them.
not to a believer. I mean, I'm talking about how a believer understands them.
Kenan, can I ask you, I mean, given that you've given us here a sort of chronology of morality, I wonder whether you'd come to any conclusions about where morality was heading. I mean, is it always a kind of progress in your view, or is there some final end point to be gained? Are we always going forward with morality, do you think?
Well, certainly development. In other words, that morality changes and shifts over time. And that development isn't arbitrary because it's related to other kinds of developments, social, economic, political developments too. And the morality of today is, I would say, considerable progress on the moral world of 1,000, 2,000 years ago. I mean, people look back on the 20th century and say, look at the 20th century, the Holocaust, mass killings, ethnic cleansing. It is an immoral world that we live in. But in fact, the fact that we recognise it as immoral in a way that people may not have 1,000, 2,000 years ago, when those kinds of mass killings were seen as just part of their moral world, that itself is, to me, moral progress.
There's a focus and a scrutiny on morality publicly, Natalie, even if it doesn't translate into everyone becoming more moral.
Which it may not.
Which it may not, but I mean, how do you judge that? And reading Kenan's book in the light of your own work and the other works around the table, which really go back to something much more visceral, much more a role of gut feeling and the need and sometimes desire to expunge, to get rid of things that you don't like in the world.
Yeah, I find it quite easy to operate on two completely separate levels, I have to be honest. The reasonable kind of, by day, my Bruce Wayne persona is reading Kenan's book, and I feel very, reasonably morally advanced. I'm quite a good person. I give money to charity. I'm a blood donor. I seem nice. But I can't deny that by night, my Batman alter ego, when typing away at this book, is somebody thinking a great deal more about revenge than about forgiveness. I freely acknowledge that forgiveness is the more moral choice. It's clearly the better choice. And if you have that gift, that capacity to forgive, and I have to be honest, I think it is a gift, then you're going to be happier for sure than me. My only option is to wait until I've forgotten who you were, who was mean to me.
Have you got an inner Greek, Simon?
I've got many inner selves, not all of which I'm going to reveal right now. I think I was just thinking generally that in drama and in writing, forgiveness always seems to me to be so much more extraordinary than revenge. If you can get an act of forgiveness to work on stage or in a piece of writing, it always, for me, transcends just ideas of bloodlust and revenge, and to strive for those moments as a writer is quite something.
But I'm not sure that vengeance is always, or the desire for revenge is always immoral, and the desire for forgiveness is always moral. I mean, I think it depends on context. And I think part of the problem in thinking about morality is that we try and be absolute rather than think about these issues in their context. And I think it's one of the problems of our time is a desire for what I'd call ethical concrete, the absolute sense of this is right and this is wrong in whatever context. And it seems to me that one can only understand what is right and wrong in specific contexts.
But Frank, as a dramatist, is forgiveness as interesting as retribution and revenge and reasonable audiences hankering for more blood to be shed?
Well, both in Natalie's book and in Simon's dramatisation of The Last Days of Troy, I was completely wrong-footed by the book, and I didn't anticipate what was going to happen. So Natalie's learnt a lot from the Greeks in terms of plotting, and Simon springs a gigantic surprise at the end, which I cannot reveal, but they are both, I think, rooted in forgiveness and how unpredictable forgiveness is. So it's a marvellous dramatic device as well as, if you like, a marvellous moral release to have suddenly, shockingly, these acts which you could not have anticipated. You really couldn't have.
I don't want to waste having a practising playwright in the room. Have you found it as alluring and as interesting to write scenes of forgiveness as you have scenes of conflict?
Well, I did do a version of Hecuba that Natalie was talking about 8 years ago, and I based my play The Matchbox on it. It's a monologue about a woman with her parents seeking terrible vengeance for the death of a child. And so many people wanted me to stop at the moment of forgiveness. But if it's based on Hecuba, then it has to go on. It has to go on till the retaliation is taken. There's a myth that Hecuba is a broken back clay, but in fact it's a very, very consistent clay. A wonderful analysis of a mind seriously diseasing itself by exposure of ultraviolence. I couldn't have written an act of forgiveness there. I have in other plays, but not in that one, because I think that if I were to be true to the experience of the character, she had to carry out what Hecuba does.
Would have been too distorting. Kenan, if we come up to date, we often read Creed occurs saying that there's a moral crisis or a sense of moral uncertainty, which is in some way exceeds what has gone before. And I was very interested at the end of your book, you say the human condition is that of possessing no moral safety net. Do you think that is purely a modern concern, or is that really where morality leads us, that we have to construct it, we have to police it ourselves? There is no external validation at all.
It's a debate that has been going on for a very long time. Are moral codes objective and set in some transcendental realm, or set in stone in tablets of stone as in monotheistic religions, or are they simply a matter of taste, preference? It seems to me neither is true. I think we've kind of divided morality into either being like a fact, like a scientific fact, or being like a taste, like, do I like ice cream, do I like Barry Manilow? And it seems to me that morality is neither. And what it really comes down to is the relationship between facts and values. That there's a tendency either to collapse values into facts and see that they're facts, or to wrench the two apart. And the bridge between facts and values, it seems to me, is the human being. Humans are, as rational, moral, autonomous beings, are the ones that relate facts to values. The values of what we want are related to the kind of beings that we are and the kind of society that we live in.
Well, there on the recognition that morality is neither ice cream and definitely not Barry Manilow, we must leave it with thanks to all my guests. Kenan Malik's The Quest for a Moral Compass, A Global History of Ethics, and Natalie Haynes' The Amber Fury are both out now. The new opera Thebans, with words by Frank McGuinness, composed by Julian Anderson, is at the London Coliseum, and Simon Armitage's The Last Days of Troy is on at the Royal Exchange, Manchester. That's till the beginning of June, and then it transfers to Shakespeare's Globe. The play is also published this week. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe will be back in the chair, asking whether it's better to lead from the front or wield power from the sidelines. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Today about resonances. You have some that have stitched in, which seem to point forward to World War I. Do you think that's a bit of a stretch?
No, actually, I think it's more difficult to keep these things out. World War I is in people's minds, the idea of commemoration and elegy, and also the horror, because you talk about World War I and it always brings up those terrible images of the battlefield, and those images were in Homer's mind as well. Equally, I think within the piece as I've written it, there is a parallel to not just what's going on now, but what seems to me to have been going on, since Homer's day, and that is some kind of conflict between East and West. The Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, that cultural, political, economic, religious. I suppose as Hera says to him at one point, you're going to have to get used to it. And I kept thinking about all those people that you see on the Royal Mile during the Edinburgh Festival, standing there on boxes, spray painted, quite often as classical characters with their hand out, begging for money, and that contradiction really between being a god or a royal of some kind, and yet actually being a street person.
I'm interested that you stitched together various accounts, various authors from the classical world to give yourself this narrative.
I think the job of the playwright, even when you're dealing with ancient texts and ancient subjects, is to create a plausible universe, a world that people can believe in. And you can stretch the fabric of that universe with the language without actually breaking it. Something that, completely anachronistic, mention of a...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
It's all Greek to me and my guests here today, pursued by the fates, guided by Zeus, frequently cursed but with a smidgen of mortal free will. They have, in their various ways, been in search of the traces of ancient Greeks in our lives and our beliefs today. Simon Armitage is a poet and translator who's spun a new tale of the last days of Troy from various classical sources. The playwright Frank McGuinness has reimagined the Thebans in a libretto for English National Opera. Natalie Haynes combines teenagers and a tale of bloody Greek-inspired revenge. What could possibly go wrong? And the writer Kenan Malik has been delving into the roots of modern morality in his latest book on the history of global ethics. Simon, the last days of Troy, you start the play in modern-day Turkey, in Herzliya, with Zeus now reduced to playing himself as a statue for today's legions of tourists. Why this particular reincarnation?
Well, I'd been to the archaeological site, and it was a place that always haunted me anyway. You know, it's somewhere that stands between mythology and rumour and history. And originally, when I started writing the play, there's so much information and backstory that I wanted to get into it. I'd actually created a latter-day reporter, a war correspondent in the region. But the more I played with the play, I suddenly started becoming very interested in the idea of Zeus as an immortal, as somebody who could not die, and started to wonder what the gods were doing if they could not die, but nobody believed in them anymore. And
that's a challenge to immortality, isn't it?
It is, yeah. A modern noun object like a mobile phone will break the spell. But in terms of what people say to each other and how they say it, I think you can take risks, because if you stick to a language that we might be able to call original and authentic, you'll be back to the original poem. In terms of the story, the two stories really that I've stitched together are the story of the Iliad and Virgil's later telling of what happened at the end of Troy. And I simply thought that, you know, modern theatre goers deserve and require an ending. They want to know who wins the war. They want to know who happens to Achilles. These things are implied. But we want to see them, and I wanted a big horse in this play anyway.
Well, I think if you can have the Trojan War without the horse, it would really not be worth the cover price, would it? True enough. But the story of the Trojan War specifically, we're talking